So let's talk about these three subsets that
Yeah.
you've identified within evangelicalism, and then we'll talk about, because the Latino vote is I would think more highly Catholic, and there's no way, shape, or form, even the media classifies Catholics as evangelicals for the most part. But let's talk about these three subsets and how you've understood them.
Yeah, no, that's great. So the Jacksonian term I borrow from Walter Russell Mead, who is a scholar, mostly writing in foreign policy, but he identifies them as there's a Jacksonian impulse in American politics, um, which is very has a nationalistic side. It's very assertive, but it's very focused on kind of home issues. Jacksonian
Backwoodsy.
yeah. Jacksonians don't like to go abroad looking for dragons to kill. They're focused on the home front. They're focused on strengthening America, and they're very patriotic. But they're not overseas adventurers, right? And Mead contrasts them with Wilsonians, who are, very. They have more crusades they're on, and he contrasts them with Hamiltonians, who are more business interests, right? And he contrasts them with Jeffersonians, who are kind of these idealists and so forth. So he has these categories that he develops in some of his research. But in 2016, he noted that there was this Jacksonian impulse, and as Logan mentioned, like this Jacksonian element in American politics is longstanding and had for over a century or so formed the backbone of the Democratic Party. Kind of, it was mostly in the rural South, but not exclusively so. And But it was the blue collar working class vote, rural and urban, that supported the Democratic Party. And so um, what what Walter Russell Mead had pointed out in 2012 was that Obama had really, you know, almost forcibly sought to move the Democratic Party away from these Jacksonians. And you remember his famous phrase that, well, these Jacksonian, he didn't use the term Jacksonian, but he basically said they cling to their guns and their religion, and he hinted that they're kind of xenophobic, right? And Walter Russell Mead had this to say about that time, the Obama coalition. He said, virtually everything about progressive politics today is about liquidating the Jacksonian influence in American life. President Obama and his coalition aim to crush what Jacksonians love, empower what they fear, and exalt what they hate. So I think Mead was right about this, and Jacksonians thought that he was right about this. They saw their natural home in the Democratic Party did not want them anymore. In fact, the Democratic Party was trying to liquidate their economic prospects, was liquidating their cultural prospects, and they wanted nothing of it, and they wanted to resist that. So then they turned to the GOP, and in 2012, what do they see? Well, they see the GOP nominating Mitt Romney. He's a Wall Street guy. He's a free market globalization guy. Well, Jacksonians had fought against NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. They had fought against outsourcing the auto industries and the steel industries. And if you read Hillbilly Elegy, that's half about how, these parts of Southern Ohio were just devastated by the decline of the auto industry and the decline of the steel industry. And that really devastated these communities economically. So they look around and see Obama deprecating them, essentially trying to liquidate any influence they have in American life. And they look over to the Republicans, who might be okay with them clinging to their guns and religion, but the Republicans have like devastated their economic prospects. And so, in 2012, when Romney loses to Obama, Obama had constructed this pretty dynamic political coalition. You have people like Sean Trendy over at Real Clear Politics noting that, hey, there's about 7 million missing voters in the electorate, and they tend to correlate with these communities in the urban Midwest and the Appalachia. And I know anecdotal evidence from people talking about parents who live in that area who just didn't vote. There was no motivation. There was nobody to vote fair in their mind. They had pretty much been alienated from American political life, and they were just out in 2012. And Sean Trinde even pointed that you're going to need a political entrepreneur to bring them back. Well, lo and behold, who was that political entrepreneur? It seemed to be Donald Trump in 2016. He whether it was intuitive or whatnot, he sought to bring these Jacksonian voters, who, by the way, in 1980 we called them Reagan Democrats. Reagan had appealed to the same type of voter, and he won important electoral victories in 80 and 84, partially with this coalition. But what happened to Reagan? Well, after his term ends, who succeeds him? George H.W. Bush, blue blood establishment Republican. And basically, from the end of Reagan's term, from 88 to 2016, the establishment wing of the Republican Party dominated Republican politics. And so it really was, you bookend that period with Reagan tapping into these Jacksonian blue collar Reagan Democrats, and you have Trump. But what does Trump do that's different? He doesn't settle for a peace with the establishment. He seeks basically a takeover of the Republican Party, and his shock troops are these Jacksonian voters. And that's why it's been very cantankerous and nasty. And basically, you've had a civil war in the Republican Party, because Trump's like, hey, these people have been sidelined from American politics, and I aim to be a voice for them, and I aim to make them a force again in American politics. And one can argue that he probably has succeeded, at least in this point. At least they matter again in American politics. They're people you can't ignore, and you can't just disregard them. And so anyway, so that's a bit of the narrative of how they had been excluded, and Trump really is the vehicle that has brought them in. And that's when I analyze them. That's why Jacksonians don't care. People complain, well, they don't care what Trump says, and he can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and they won't care, and all these things. They overlook all of his flaws. And one would say, well, yes, they overlook all of his flaws because they, as Walter Russell Mead pointed out, they were being their whole communities were being liquidated from American cultural life and American economic life.
Yeah, their way of life was being canceled. Now you offer an example of who would fit within the evangelical Jacksonian, and you point to Mama, which was the grandmother of J.D. Vance in the book, and also if you've seen it in the movie, here's kind of a thumbnail sketch of what we're talking about as a Trump supporter. And how did you describe that?
Yeah, no, she if you watch the movie or read the book, I've done both. She is a character for sure, but I do think she. I mean, again, these are archetypes. They don't capture everyone. But as I described her, Mama is a Jesus-loving, gun-toting, chain-smoking, foul-mouthed matriarch from rural Kentucky, who fiercely defends her family and provides stability and guidance for her grandson. And that those elements, not everyone fits that element, but she had a deep faith in some way. J.D. Vance talks about her reading her Bible regularly. She talks about her love for Jesus and refers to him and tries to live in her view as what Jesus would want her to do. But at the same time, she doesn't exhibit these kind of middle class kind of behaviors. She chain smokes. She's foul mouthed. She has guns stashed everywhere. So she's for like a suburban evangelical voter, they don't necessarily live in the same world, but they share in some vague sense a theological grounding in Protestant theology.
And how much of these Jacksonians then did Trump capture? How much?
Well, it's hard to get exact numbers. The best numbers I have are, and I haven't been able to find better ones, are all the way back from the 2016 primaries, because they were tracking dynamics like church attendance. They were tracking dynamics like, church attendance is the main one. And Michael Barone had noticed that that in like say Michigan around Grand Rapids, which is a evangelical kind of hotbed, Dutch Reformed, so tight knit evangelical communities. They were very non-Trump, never Trump areas, right? Same thing in Missouri, the Assemblies of God, which I grew out of that tradition. they have tight church networks, and they tended initially to be not very favorable to Trump. Where he was strongest was in rural Missouri, where people don't attend church regularly necessarily. There's higher rates of disability insurance. There's disconnectedness. There's some of the social pathologies you see in economically depressed areas. But there is this kind of high religiosity, even though it's not institutionalized. It's more of an individualized. And so Mama kind of fits that characteristic, right? She doesn't necessarily she goes to church, but not as often, not
Yeah.
weekly. She's not tied into any kind of like
But you tell
community
her,
groups.
you tell her she don't believe in Jesus, and you're going to get a fight on your hands.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And she's very protective of her family. Right. And Mama is another example because she was a huge Bill Clinton fan. She loved Bill Clinton. Right. He's a Democrat. He's a Southerner. He just had those sensibilities that she would identify with. Right. Um, but the Mamas of the world by 2016 and 2024 seem to be, voting for Trump.
Okay, so that's the Jacksonian evangelical. Who are the other two classes that you put into the
Yeah.
article?
So yeah, and that's the thing. So in 2016, you have roughly, as best we can tell, you have about 36%. If you're looking at South Carolina primaries and stuff, that are I would say the Jacksonians, but that leaves 60 to 70% who aren't. But these are again drawn on some of Michael Barone's observations. These are people. This is the Grand Rapids crowd. These are the Springfield, Missouri crowd, and these are, I would say, your mainstream evangelicals, which are, they go to church regularly. They're socially connected. They may be part of Rotary clubs and PTAs and Little Leagues, so they're part of communities, and so they're civically engaged. And so I kind of labeled them the Tocquevillians, Alexis de Tocqueville, who focused on social capital, the capital that builds up when people are engaged in their communities, they're serving in their communities, they form social networks. They use these social networks to get things done. Right? In the old days they would have done barn raising. Now they do PTA funding drives, or they might take a missions team down to Mexico to build a shelter or something like that. So they're very socially engaged and very community oriented. And this, I was estimating around 2016, is about 60 to 70% of this evangelical vote that we're talking about. Again, there's a lot of diversity within that, but this is your mainstream evangelicals. And Trump couldn't have won in 2016 with just the Jacksonians. They were his base. They were the ones that allowed him not to get blown out of the Republican primaries, but they were just a base to build on. But to win both the Republican, well, yeah, to win the primary, but certainly to win the general election, he needed to woo the Tocquevillians. And
Yeah, I think in 2020 more of those stayed away.
Yeah,
Maybe didn't vote at all, and he lost. He went down in that specific demographic.
I think so. Um, and there's probably a lot of dynamics, and the dynamics are reflective of individual assessments and prudential judgments. But in broad strokes, the pro-life issue, the abortion issue, is a key issue for Tocquevillians, right? And you probably have anecdotes you could refer to. I know people who say, yeah, pro-life is one of my main issues, and not the main issue. And they basically engaged in a transaction with Trump. Like, look, we've been voting for Republicans for decades and no movement on the abortion issue. And Trump said, look, and he knew he had to get these voters. So he said, look, I will appoint conservative justices, and I will deliver for you on the abortion issue. And enough Tocquevillians took him at his word, and they said, okay, we'll take that deal. And so they trusted. I remember a lot of, you guys probably do too, a lot of discussion around that time in 2016, like, well, can we trust him on this? He's not really a conservative. He's not really an evangelical. We don't even know how religious he is. But when it was Hillary or Trump, enough of them pulled the lever for Trump, and they took a risk on the abortion issue and trusted that he would deliver. And guess what? He appointed 3 conservative justices, and Roe v. Wade was overturned. And so there was a lot of
Yeah.
never Trumpers who were, he's gonna abandon you, he's not going to deliver, and yet they were wrong. I remember David French saying, specifically to mention a person, saying, "No, he's not going to deliver here. He's not going to. This is not going to happen." And I'm assuming he didn't vote for Trump, but Trump does win, and Trump does deliver to judges who do deliver an overturn of Roe v. Wade. And now David Trump's out there. Oh, this is great. This is awesome. And I'm thinking, but what did he do to affect that change, right? So, anyways,
Yeah.
I'm getting sidetracked on that. But the Tocquevillians were key to Trump winning in 2016, and what the numbers show is that they stayed with him, and he maybe even added some of those votes in 2024.
And so the third category would be what? The elite evangelicals, the
bad guys.
Yeah, these are hard to measure as well. Back in the day, and I don't even know what numbers. I mean, most evangelicals, I would think, would fall into those first two groups. But you do have a class of evangelicals, I would argue, that are elite. They run, World Vision. I'm not thinking of people. They run the big evangelical organizations. They would be what some people call big Eva. They're academics, they're presidents or administrators in evangelical academic institutions, or they're professors in evangelical institutions, and they're pastors in big mega churches with big brands who are very culturally attuned. And so what you saw in 2016 through 2020 and through 2024 is a large portion of these groups are like, never Trump. We don't like him. He's dangerous. He's erratic. He's all these things. And I think what's different for them is, it isn't simply an individual choice. They are thinking about the brand of the institution they are representing, right? And so Trump's erraticness, Trump's foibles, if you want to put it that way, Trump's, what I put in the article, his aesthetic, I think, is a big part of it. They are nervous. They don't want to be associated with that, frankly, and they don't want their organization to be associated with that. And so they're very cautious, to the point of saying, I can't support that. I won't support that. In fact, I'm going to try to put a stop to it. And that takes a lot of forms. But one of them were these attempts to have Bible studies in churches to, like, basically get evangelicals to kind of disengage in a partisan way. And what we saw is that just didn't work. But for elites going forward, as long as the culture is what it is now, the culture may be shifting, but they're sunk in. They are never Trump till they die, and I don't see that changing in the near term. It may longer term, but so they're just subject to different forces than maybe the Tocquevillians or the Jacksonians.
Okay.
The Tocquevillians are somewhat attuned to cultural strains and cultural opinion, but not as much as the elites, I would say.
Yeah. So as Christianity Today, for example, you've got a lot of folks who have the journalism pedigree, have come up through the journalism schools, so they would fall into this kind of this elite status idea as well.
Yeah. Well, I think extending
so.
Dr. Guerrero's point, I think, is important. Maybe even looking at the political, like taking this sort of this tripartite view of the evangelical voting bloc. I think the strategy would have been that the Democrats, in sort of like constructing this block and hitting it, was the hopes that the elite and the Tocquevillians would go one way and lead the Jacksonians. And that didn't happen. It ended up being that most of the Tocquevillians stayed with the Jacksonians, that actually the transaction was worth it. We did get some of the things that we wanted. Sure, the aesthetic appeal, which is not so much the main focus of the Tocquevillian view, is just not enough that the elites, were the ones that were kind of really pushing that. And that's a David French. A lot of these people have like doubled down, or even have gotten to the point where they just resent anyone that is of this sort of like Tocquevillian transactional view, or the Jackson. I think perhaps they've always hated the Jacksonian views. I'm not sure. The elites versus Jacksonians have always been a long, difficult road. But it is interesting, and I wanted to ask you this, Dr. Guerrero, was, do you think that the elites going forward, Well, I mean, like the analogy with like Jackson in the Supreme Court, like you have that famous like, we're just gonna, who cares what the court says. In the same way, is it sort of going forward? Do you think there's just now going to be a kind of a fissure between uh, the sort of Tocquevillian and Jacksonian future versus the elites are just going to have to do their own thing for a while?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know that I have a great answer for it. Yeah, I think elites have to do some soul searching. That there is a tendency amongst elites, and we see it in the evangelical world, of a sort of talking down to people who should know better. And this talking down has not got them anywhere, and so they're going to have to reevaluate. Elites, like, do we want to just separate from the evangelical movement? And I think some have, but there's some who just can't or won't, and they have sincere beliefs that tie them to the evangelical movement. And so there's going to have to be some soul searching, like, what do we do about these masses of people who aren't listening to us, who don't take our advice, who don't value our expertise and our superior knowledge and our credentialing? They're not listening to us. And so, I mean, I can appreciate that's a tough position to be in, but it's somewhat self imposed. And I can appreciate why they made the move that they did, because they were going to pay huge social costs by supporting Trump through 2016 and 2020, and maybe organizational costs they're going to pay for supporting him, and so they didn't. But now that he's in power and he maybe has solidified some of his support. I don't. Yeah, it's a good question. I think you raised a good question. I don't have a great answer, but they're going to have to reevaluate going forward. I'm curious if you guys have some thoughts on what they would do.